Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Carter. I'm 29 years old. And the day my 3 year relationship actually ended, my boyfriend was standing in the middle of our living room, watching strangers carry his entire life out the front door in cardboard boxes. While he kept repeating the same sentence over and over, like saying it enough times might make it stop being true. This is my apartment too. It wasn't. It never had been. And the worst part, the part that still makes me feel something complicated whenever I think back on it, is that he didn't find that out from me yelling at him or from some dramatic confession scene. He found it out from a building manager holding a clipboard in a voice as flat and ordinary as someone reading off a grocery list. I'm going to tell you exactly how we got there. But I want you to sit with that image for a second first, because I think it tells you everything you need to know about how this story ends. Not with screaming, not with tears in a parking lot, with paperwork and silence, and a man slowly realizing that the woman he'd taken for granted had already finished leaving him weeks before he noticed she was gone. Mark and I met almost 4 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, and for the first year, things were genuinely good. He was charming in that effortless way some men are, the kind of charm that makes you feel, at least for a while, like you're the only interesting person in any room he walks into. We moved in together about a year into a 2-bedroom apartment that I found, that I put the deposit down on, that I signed the lease for, because Mark's credit at the time wasn't strong enough to qualify on his own. I didn't think much of that detail back then. I want you to remember it anyway, because it matters more than either of us understood at the time. The first year living together was good too. We built a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what you're supposed to build in your late 20s. Shared bills, shared furniture, most of which I'd bought myself over the years before he even moved in, piece by piece, because I'd lived alone for 2 years before him and furnished the place slowly with my own paycheck. Shared routines, Sunday grocery runs. A future we talked about constantly in the vague, hopeful way couples do when they're not actually making concrete plans, just gesturing at the idea of plans. Then, somewhere around year 2, something started shifting. I couldn't always point to a specific moment. It was more like a slow leak than a single break. Arguments became more frequent, about small things at first. Whose turn it was to do dishes, why he came home late without texting, why I seemed distant when really I was just exhausted from a job that had gotten more demanding, while he'd quietly stopped pursuing the promotion he used to talk about constantly. Intimacy faded in that specific way where neither person announces it. It just stops being a thing that happens. And you both pretend not to notice the absence because naming it feels like the first step toward admitting something neither of you wants to admit yet. I tried, though. I want to be honest about that, because I think a lot of people who've been in relationships like this know exactly what I mean when I say I tried in ways that, looking back, I'm not even sure he noticed. I planned date nights he canceled twice before we ever made it to the restaurant. I suggested couples counseling once, gently, in the middle of a quiet evening, and he laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively. The kind of laugh that tells you the idea isn't even worth a real answer. "We're fine, Lena," he said. "We don't need a stranger telling us how to talk to each other." About 2 months before everything changed, Mark suggested I take some time and visit my family. They lived about 500 miles away, in the town I'd grown up in, and I hadn't seen them in almost a year because work had been relentless, and travel always felt like something I'd get to eventually. "You need to clear your head," he said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, not quite looking at me while he said it. "Things have been tense. Maybe some space would be good for both of us." I remember thinking at the time that it was almost sweet, a small act of consideration in a relationship that had started feeling low on those. I had absolutely no idea, sitting on that plane with a paperback novel I never actually opened, that the man I'd been building a life with for 3 years saw that trip not as space for us to heal, but as an opportunity. The first day back home with my family was easy in the way it always was. My mother fussed over the fact that I looked tired. My sister Kate made fun of me for falling asleep on the couch at 8:30. It felt good, that low stakes, familiar kind of good that you forget you're missing until you're back inside it. On the second night, my old friend Priya texted asking if I wanted to grab dinner while I was in town, and I said yes immediately. Because Priya and I had known each other since high school, and some friendships just slide right back into place no matter how much time has passed. We picked a restaurant downtown, the kind with a patio strung with lights, the kind of place you go when you want an ordinary Tuesday to feel a little bit special. We were seated inside, near the window that looked out onto the patio, and about 20 minutes into our meal, mid-sentence in something Priya was telling me about her job, I looked up and felt my entire body go cold. Mark was sitting at a table on that patio. For one disorienting second, my brain tried to construct a reasonable explanation, a work trip he hadn't mentioned, a coincidence, some version of events where this made sense and didn't mean what it very clearly meant. Then I saw who he was with. It was Vanessa, his ex-girlfriend, the one he dated for almost 2 years before me, the one whose name still came up occasionally in old photos he hadn't fully deleted, the one he always described, whenever she came up at all, as just someone from a long time ago. It's not a big deal. They were laughing. His hand rested on the table, and hers was on top of it, fingers laced loosely together in the specific, unguarded way people only touch each other when they've stopped performing for an audience because they don't think there is one. I want to describe exactly what I felt in that moment because it wasn't what people usually assume. It wasn't a wave of devastation that knocked me over. It was something colder and clearer than that. It was the sensation of an answer arriving for a question I'd apparently been asking, somewhere underneath the surface, for a lot longer than I'd consciously realized. Priya followed my gaze and went very still. "Lena," she said quietly. "Is that?" "Yeah," I said. "Do you want to go say something?" I looked at them again. The way he leaned toward her, like there was nothing in the world he needed to hide. The way she touched his arm, like it was something she'd touched 100 times before, comfortably, like there had never been a 3-year relationship standing between the last time and now. "No," I said. "I want to take a picture." I lifted my phone, angled it carefully so the window glass wouldn't create a glare, and took several photos. Clear, time-stamped, undeniable. Not blurry, accidental shots, deliberate documentation because some quiet, calculating part of my brain had already decided, before the rest of me had even caught up, that I wasn't going to need an argument later. I was going to need evidence. In that moment, sitting in that restaurant with my phone in my hand, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a scene. Something colder took over instead, something that told me confrontation, right then, would only give him the chance to explain it away, to apologize just enough to muddy the clarity of what I'd just seen with my own eyes. So I finished my dinner with Priya, and then I went back to my parents' house, sat on the edge of the guest bed where I'd slept as a teenager, and looked at those photos again and again until the shock wore off and something else, something steadier, started to take its place. For the rest of that trip, I didn't call Mark to confront him. I texted him normal things. He texted back like nothing had happened because as far as he knew, nothing had. "Miss you," he wrote once, the kind of message that, 3 days earlier, would have made me feel something. Now it just felt like data, confirmation of exactly how comfortable he was, how certain he was that whatever was happening 500 miles away in that apartment we shared was completely separate from whatever he was doing on restaurant patios with women he claimed weren't a big deal. When I flew back, I want you to picture exactly what he was expecting. A woman returning from a trip, maybe a little more settled, maybe ready to talk things through. That's the woman he was prepared to greet at the door. What he got instead was someone calm, someone quiet, someone who hugged him at the door for exactly as long as a normal hug lasts, and not a second longer, who unpacked her suitcase without making a single comment about the trip, who answered his questions in short, even sentences that gave him absolutely nothing to push against. He noticed the shift. I could see in the way he watched me over the next few days, slightly too carefully, like a man checking a smoke detector that hadn't gone off yet, but probably should have. But here's the thing about people like Mark. His relief almost always outweighed his suspicion. He wanted the quiet version of me to mean everything was fine. So mostly, he let himself believe it did. What he didn't know was that the calm wasn't peace. It was the beginning of a plan. When we first moved into that apartment, almost 2 years before any of this happened, Mark's credit history wasn't strong enough to qualify as a cosigner. The lease, the property manager told us, would need to be under my name alone, with Mark listed as an occupant but not a tenant of record. At the time, it felt like a minor technicality. Just paperwork. It mattered enormously. Our lease had converted to a month-to-month agreement the year before, the way many leases do after the initial term ends if neither party renegotiates. Buried in that month-to-month clause was a simple, unremarkable sentence. Termination required 60 days written notice from the tenant of record. The tenant of record was me, only me. It had always only been me. Mark had lived in that apartment for almost 2 years, assuming a kind of safety that legally had never actually existed for him. He paid half the rent through a shared account. Sure. He kept his things there, slept there, called it home in every conversational sense of the word. But on paper, he was a guest who'd simply never left, protected by nothing except my willingness to keep him there. I sat at our kitchen table one evening while he was out, supposedly with friends, though I'd stopped asking which friends specifically, and I filled out the notice of termination. No arguments. No accusations, no emotional confrontation where I laid out everything I'd seen and demanded he explain himself. Just paperwork. For the next several weeks, there was no big speech, no slow build toward a dramatic blowout, just a steady, deliberate disengagement that I controlled completely. I stopped initiating conversations. When he tried to be affectionate, I'd gently step away. There was one night he came home, well past midnight, smelling faintly like a perfume that wasn't mine, with some vague explanation about a coworker's birthday that ran longer than expected. I looked up from my book, looked at him for a moment, and said, "Okay, that's it. Just okay." He stood there for a second like he'd been expecting a different response, almost like a part of him wanted me to fight about it, because at least a fight would have meant something was still being negotiated between us. Instead, I just went back to my book. While that quiet distance was happening on the surface, underneath it, I was building something else entirely. I'd already started looking at one-bedroom apartments the week I got back, 15 minutes from my office, with a building manager named Tony Castellano who agreed, plainly and without judgment, to coordinate viewings discreetly while Mark was out. I hired movers in advance, quietly, for a weekday when Mark would have no reason to be home. I made a list of exactly which furniture was mine, most of it, as it turned out, because I'd furnished that apartment slowly over years before he ever moved in, while he'd contributed almost nothing beyond a television and a few boxes of belongings. The final day arrived on an ordinary Thursday. I texted Mark earlier that morning, simply, "Can you come home a little early today? We need to talk about some things." I didn't explain further. The movers arrived at 9. By early afternoon, the apartment looked strange and half empty, like a stage set between productions. Mark arrived around 4. I watched his face change in real time as he stepped through the door. Confusion first, then something sharper. "What is this?" he asked, looking around at the half-stripped apartment, at the movers finishing up in the bedroom. "Lena, what's going on?" "I'm moving out," I said. My voice didn't shake. "Moving out? Why? We never even talked about." "We didn't need to talk about it," I said. "You made the decision for both of us a few weeks ago." I just finished the paperwork. He looked genuinely lost. "I don't know what you're talking about." That's when I reached into my bag and pulled out the printed photos. I'd had them developed at a small print shop near my office, deliberately, because something about a physical photograph in someone's hands carries a weight a phone screen never quite manages. I set them down on the kitchen counter, one of the only pieces of furniture still left, and slid them toward him without a word. He picked them up. I watched his face drain of color as he flipped through them, one by one. The restaurant patio, his hand on the table. Vanessa's fingers laced through his. Lena, I can explain. You don't need to, I said. I already know everything I need to know. I knew it the night I took those photos. I just didn't see the point in screaming about it 500 miles from home. For a moment, something shifted in him. Not guilt exactly, but the particular panic of a man realizing the ground underneath him had been gone for a while, and he was the only one who hadn't noticed. And then, instead of apologizing, he did what people like Mark almost always do when they're cornered. He got angry. You're being insane right now, he said, his voice rising, color coming back into his face as something closer to outrage. You took pictures of me and said nothing for 3 weeks? What kind of person does that? You set me up. I didn't set anything up, I said. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it. This is my apartment, he said, louder now, gesturing at the bare walls like volume alone could put the furniture back. I've lived here for 2 years. You can't just decide on your own to throw my entire life out the door. Mark, I kept my voice level, even as he was raising his. It was never your lease. It was never even your furniture. I think the only thing in this apartment that was actually yours was the television and 4 boxes in the hall closet. That's not the point, he snapped. I'm calling someone. This isn't legal. You can't just... That's when there was a knock at the door, and Tony Castellano stepped in, calm and unhurried, carrying a small folder under his arm. Afternoon, Tony said, nodding at Mark with the polite, professional neutrality of a man who had clearly done this exact thing more than once. Just need to go over a few details. Who is this? Mark demanded, looking between us, something close to desperation creeping into his voice now. Lena, who did you call? The building manager, I said. Tony opened the folder without rushing. Lease was terminated properly. 60 days written notice, all documentation on file, he said, in the unbothered tone of someone reading off a grocery list. Units already been re-rented. New tenants move in within 48 hours. He glanced briefly at Mark. Anything left behind after midnight tonight gets removed. That's standard procedure, nothing personal. This is insane, Mark said, turning fully toward Tony now, his voice climbing higher, the anger finally curdling into something closer to fear. I've lived here for 2 years. Doesn't that count for something? I can fight this. I'll get a lawyer. Tony didn't even blink. You're welcome to, he said evenly. But your name was never on the lease, sir. There's nothing to fight. You were never a tenant here. Legally, you were a guest. I watched the word land on Mark like a physical blow. Guest. 2 years of his life, every box he'd carried in, every night he'd slept there, assuming it was his, reduced, in one sentence, to a status he'd never bothered to question because he'd never imagined needing to. He turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched something close to real fear settle into his face. Lena, he said, quieter now, the anger gone, replaced with something more desperate. Please, can we just talk about this? Just the 2 of us? There's nothing left to talk about, I said. I think somewhere in the last few weeks you assumed this was still a negotiation. It wasn't. I just let you believe it was until I was ready. He looked down at the photos still in his hand, then back up at the half-empty apartment, then at Tony's folder, like he was trying to find one single thing in the room that still belonged to him. He didn't find one. By evening, the apartment was almost completely empty. What remained was a small scattered pile in the middle of the living room floor. His clothes, his toiletries, a few personal items that had clearly never been organized or planned for, because Mark had never once imagined a version of this relationship ending on someone else's terms instead of his own. He stood there in the doorway of what used to be our living room, looking at the bare walls, the marks on the carpet where furniture used to sit. The absence of an entire life he'd assumed was permanent. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, and this time there was no anger left in it at all. Just a kind of stunned exhaustion. "Where am I supposed to go tonight?" I didn't answer that. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply that, for the first time in 3 years, his next move genuinely wasn't my responsibility to plan. I left the keys on the counter, exactly where Tony had asked me to leave them, and I walked out without looking back, because there was nothing behind me anymore that I needed to see one more time. I want to tell you honestly that the weeks after weren't some glamorous cinematic victory lap. Moving into a new apartment alone, even when you're the one who chose it, even when you're the one who planned every detail of it, still comes with its own quiet kind of grief. 3 years doesn't disappear just because you finally have the strength to walk away from it on your own terms. There were nights in that new apartment, smaller than the one I'd left, where I sat on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and felt the loneliness of starting over settle into my chest. I think stories like this sometimes skip past the part where the strong, composed woman still has to go home to an empty apartment and sit with what she's lost, even when what she lost wasn't actually good for her. Mark texted a few times in those first weeks. Apologies, mostly, the kind that arrive too late to mean what they're trying to mean. He mentioned once that he'd ended up staying on a friend's couch for almost a month before finding a room to rent across town. A small, sublet room, no lease of his own again, which struck me as a strange kind of poetic justice I never set out to engineer. I didn't respond to most of those messages. Not out of cruelty, and not even really out of anger anymore, but because I understood clearly and calmly that responding would have meant reopening a door I'd already spent weeks carefully, deliberately closing. A few months later, Priya told me, somewhat reluctantly, that she'd heard through a mutual friend that things hadn't worked out between Mark and Vanessa either. Apparently, the same patterns that had shown up in our relationship had shown up again, faster this time, because some people don't actually learn from the consequences of their choices. They just relocate them onto someone new. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt mostly a kind of distant calm, the calm of someone who'd already moved several rooms away from a fire she used to live inside of. About 6 months after that Thursday, I got a small raise at work, signed a longer lease on my own apartment for the first time in my life with absolutely no one else's name attached to it, and adopted the dog Mark and I had talked about for years, but never actually gotten. I named her after no one in particular, which felt, somehow, like the most honest decision I'd made in a long time. If you've made it this far with me, I think there's one thing I want to leave you with, because it took me almost 3 years and one very quiet, very deliberate exit to finally understand it myself. You don't owe anyone a dramatic confrontation in order for your hurt to be valid. You don't have to scream in a restaurant or cry in front of someone to prove that what they did to you mattered. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't loud at all. Sometimes it's paperwork. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical planning that the other person doesn't even notice until it's already finished. And then a single afternoon where everything they assumed was permanent gets carried out the door in boxes while they stand there, finally understanding just a little too late. I learned the hard way that you should always know exactly what's actually yours, not just emotionally, but legally, financially, on paper, because the people who take you for granted are often the same people who never bothered to check. If you've ever had to leave quietly instead of loudly, planned your exit instead of demanding one, I'd love to hear how you found your own version of that moving day. Because I don't think there's only one right way to leave someone who didn't deserve you. I think there's just the way that finally lets you breathe again. And if any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever sat across from someone you loved and quietly realized before they did that it was already over, I hope this told you what I needed to hear back then. You don't have to fight loudly to win. Sometimes you just have to walk out the door and let them realize, all on their own, exactly what they lost.